What's going on? What did I do wrong? Nazario asked again, his voice steady despite the guns pointed at him. The question hung in the air for a moment before Officer Gutierrez responded. What's going on is you're not cooperating, Gutierrez said, his tone sharp and accusatory. When we say get out, you get out. An older couple who had been filling their car at a nearby pump watched the scene unfold with growing concern. The husband whispered to his wife, "That's a military man they've got at gunpoint." Inside the gas station, the night shift cashier had noticed the commotion and was now standing by the large front window, her hand hovering near the phone, unsure whether to call for help. Two teenage boys buying sodas had joined her at the window, their eyes wide as they witnessed the escalating situation. "I'm trying to understand what's happening," Nazario replied, still keeping his hands where the officers could see them. His military training had taught him to remain composed in high-stress situations, but this was testing the limits of his self-control. "I've done nothing wrong." Officer Crocker, the younger of the two officers, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his gun still aimed at Nazario. "You didn't stop when we turned on our lights." "I was looking for a well-lit area for safety," Nazario explained again, his voice betraying a hint of frustration. "I was being cautious." A truck driver who had pulled in for coffee now stood frozen beside his rig, watching the scene unfold. He had served in the military himself years ago, and something about seeing a man in uniform being treated this way made his stomach turn. "You've got two options," Gutierrez barked, his stance becoming more aggressive. "You can get out of the car and talk to us like a man, or we can do this the hard way." The conflicting commands continued as Crocker shouted, "Keep your hands out." "The window." At the same moment, Gutierrez yelled, "Get out of the car now." Nazario's training had never prepared him for this impossible situation: comply with one order and risk violating the other. Move his hands to unbuckle his seatbelt and risk being seen as reaching for a weapon, or stay put and be accused of not complying. "I'm honestly afraid to get out of the car," Nazario admitted, his voice quieter now, the vulnerability in his admission standing in stark contrast to his military bearing. Gutierrez's response was immediate and chilling. "Yeah, you should be." Those 4 words sent a ripple of unease through the growing crowd of onlookers. The truck driver exchanged glances with a woman who had stopped pumping gas to watch. They didn't know each other, but in that moment they shared a wordless acknowledgement that something was deeply wrong with what they were witnessing. Inside his SUV, Nazario felt a cold fear settling in his stomach. He'd faced dangerous situations before during his military service, but there had always been protocols, rules of engagement, a sense of order. This felt chaotic and unpredictable. His phone continued to record the encounter from its position on the dashboard, capturing every word. "Listen carefully," Gutierrez said, lowering his voice to a threatening growl. "What's going to happen now is you're fixing to ride the lightning, son." The phrase hung in the air, its implied violence unmistakable. To ride the lightning was slang for execution, a threat that seemed wildly disproportionate for what had begun as a simple traffic stop. Nazario noticed that Gutierrez now had his taser in hand, the implication clear. The truck driver who had been watching turned to the woman next to him and whispered, "Did he just threaten that soldier?" She nodded, her face a mask of concern. "Someone needs to do something." But what could anyone do? The officers had the authority, the weapons, and the power in this situation. The bystanders were just that, witnesses to a scene that was quickly spiraling out of control. Inside the gas station, the cashier had picked up the phone now, quietly speaking to someone on the other end, her eyes never leaving the drama unfolding. In the parking lot. "I'm trying to comply," Nazario said, his voice still calm but firm. "But you're giving me conflicting orders. I can't keep my hands out the window and get out of the car at the same time." The logic of his statement seemed to have no effect on the officers. Their weapons remained trained on him, their faces set in expressions of determined authority. "Last chance," Gutierrez warned. "Get out now, or things are going to get real ugly." A family with 2 young children had pulled into the gas station, unaware of the situation until they saw the police cars with flashing lights and the officers with drawn weapons. The father quickly put his car in reverse and backed away, not wanting his kids to witness whatever was about to happen. The night air had grown colder, or perhaps it just felt that way to Nazario as he considered his options. His military identification card hung visibly from his uniform, a cruel irony not lost on him. He had sworn to protect a country where he now found himself being threatened by those who had taken a similar oath. "I serve this country every day," Nazario said, a note of disbelief creeping into his voice. "I'm in uniform, and this is how you treat me?" Officer Crocker seemed to hesitate for a moment, perhaps registering the absurdity of the situation. But Gutierrez remained unmoved, his stance becoming even more aggressive. "Your uniform don't mean nothing right now," Gutierrez retorted. "What matters is you comply with our commands." The truck driver who had been watching had now taken out his own phone and was recording the encounter. He wasn't the only one. Several other bystanders had their phones out as well, sensing that what they were witnessing needed to be documented. Inside his SUV, Nazario took a deep breath, trying to center himself amid the chaos. He had faced danger before, but never like this. Never, from those sworn to protect and serve. The irony was not lost on him. He could be deployed to a conflict zone tomorrow, trusted with sophisticated military equipment and the lives of other soldiers. Yet here he was being treated as a threat because of a minor traffic issue. "Please," Nazario said, his voice level but insistent. "Can we talk about this reasonably? I'm not resisting, I'm just trying to understand what's happening." But reasoned discussion seemed to be the last thing on Gutierrez's mind. "We're done talking," he snapped. "You had your chance to do this the easy way." The cashier inside the store had finished her phone call and was now standing with 3 other employees, all of them watching through the window with expressions of concern. One of them, an older man with gray hair, shook his head in disgust. "That ain't right," he muttered. "Man's serving his country and they got guns on him like he's some kind of criminal." The minutes stretched on, feeling like hours to Nazario, as he remained in his vehicle, hands visible, trying to navigate the impossible situation. The officers continued to shout commands, sometimes contradicting each other, their weapons never wavering from their target. A young woman who had been watching from her car finally stepped out and approached another bystander. "Should we do something?" she asked quietly. "Call someone?" The man looked uncertain. "Who would we call?" "The police are already here." That simple exchange captured the helplessness felt by everyone watching. When those meant to protect are the ones creating the danger, where does one turn? Inside his vehicle, Nazario remained outwardly calm, but his mind was racing. He thought about his family, his fellow soldiers, his future. Would this be how it ended for him, a traffic stop gone horribly wrong? The thought was almost too much to bear. "This isn't right," he said, more to himself than to the officers, but his words were picked up by the phone recording the encounter. "This isn't how things are supposed to work." Officer Gutierrez took a step closer to the vehicle, his weapon still raised. "One more chance," he warned, his voice hard with menace. "Get out now, or what happens next is on you." The gas station. Lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the scene. Bystanders watched in tense silence. The night that had begun as ordinary for everyone involved had transformed into something none of them would soon forget. A moment when the lines between protector and threat blurred beyond recognition, and a uniformed soldier found himself staring down the barrels of guns pointed by those who, like him, had sworn to serve. The standoff at the BP gas station had reached a breaking point. Lieutenant Nazario remained in his SUV with his hands visible through the window, the officers, guns still trained on him under the harsh fluorescent lights. The night had grown colder, and the crowd of onlookers had increased, some watching silently, others recording with their phones, all of them sensing they were witnessing something profoundly wrong. "I don't want to reach for my seatbelt," Nazario explained, his voice steady despite the guns pointed at him. "I'm afraid if I move my hands you'll shoot me." His words hung in the air, reasonable and terrifying at once. The truck driver who had been watching from beside his rig looked away for a moment, unable to bear the tension of the scene. When he looked back, Officer Gutierrez had taken a step closer to Nazario's vehicle. "You've had your chance," Gutierrez said, his voice flat and cold. Without further warning, he raised his hand and sprayed a stream of pepper spray directly through the open window and into Nazario's face. The effect was immediate and devastating. Nazario gasped, his eyes burning, with an intensity that defied description. It felt like someone had poured liquid fee, his eyes knowing it would only make the burning worse. "Oh my God," whispered a woman watching from her car. "They just pepper sprayed him for nothing." Inside the gas station, the night shift cashier covered her mouth in shock. The teenage boys, who had been watching wide-eyed, now looked at each other in disbelief. One of them started toward the door, but his friend pulled him back, shaking his head. "Get out. Get out now," Gutierrez shouted, his voice rising above Nazario's coughing. Blinded by the spray and choking on its fumes, Nazario fumbled with his seatbelt. The burning sensation had spread to his entire face, and his lungs felt like they were filled with fire. Still, his military training took over. Focus on the task at hand, control your breathing, complete the mission. Right now, the mission was to survive this encounter. "I can't see," Nazario managed to say between coughs. "I can't breathe properly." But the officers showed no concern for his condition. As Nazario finally freed himself from the seatbelt and began to open his car door, Gutierrez grabbed him by the arm and yanked him from the vehicle. Nazario stumbled, disoriented by the pain and unable to see clearly through his burning eyes. "The ground," Crocker shouted, grabbing Nazario's other arm. "I need a supervisor," Nazario said, his voice strained but still carrying the authority of his military rank. "I want to speak to whoever's in charge." His request was met with force rather than words. Gutierrez delivered a swift knee strike to the back of Nazario's leg, causing him to buckle. As he fell to his knees on the cold concrete of the gas station, several onlookers gasped. The truck driver, who had been watching, stepped forward instinctively, then stopped, knowing intervention would likely make things worse. "This isn't right," he said to no one in particular, his hands clenched into helpless fists at his sides. On the ground, Nazario continued to struggle for breath. The pepper spray had coated his face, his uniform, even seeped into the collar of his shirt. Each breath brought a fresh wave of burning into his lungs. Through the haze of pain, he felt his arms being wrenched behind his back, the cold metal of handcuffs biting into his wrists. "Stop resisting," Gutierrez shouted, though Nazario was offering no resistance beyond his body's involuntary reactions to the chemical assault. "I'm not resisting," Nazario managed to say between coughing fits. "I can't breathe." His words carried a haunting echo of other police encounters that had ended in tragedy. Several bystanders exchanged worried glances, the collective memory of those cases hanging heavy in the air. The family that had backed their car away earlier was now parked across the street, the parents watching with shocked expressions while trying to block their children's view of what was happening. "Why are they hurting that soldier, Dad?" a young voice asked, carrying across the quiet night air. The father had no answer to give. On the ground, Nazario struggled to maintain his composure through the burning pain. His military uniform, which he'd worn with such pride, was now stained with dirt and pepper spray. The irony wasn't lost on him even through the fog of his discomfort. He'd faced enemies abroad, only to be treated like one at home. "I need medical attention," he said, his voice hoarse from the chemical irritants. "Please." For the first time since the encounter began, someone seemed to hear him. An older woman who had been watching from her car approached cautiously, keeping a respectful distance from the officers. "I'm a nurse," she said, her voice firm despite her obvious nervousness. "He needs help. That spray can cause serious respiratory issues." Officer Crocker looked at her, then back at Nazario, who was still coughing and struggling to breathe on the ground. Something in the officer's demeanor shifted slightly. Perhaps the presence of a medical professional, perhaps the growing crowd of witnesses, or perhaps his own conscience finally breaking through. "We'll call for medics," Crocker said, reaching for his radio. Gutierrez seemed less moved by Nazario's condition. He stood over the handcuffed lieutenant, his stance one of undiminished authority. If you had just complied from the beginning, none of this would have happened, he said, as if Nazario's suffering was a choice he had made rather than one that had been forced upon him. The nurse didn't leave, standing her ground at a safe distance. He needs his face cleaned with cool water, she said. And those cuffs are too tight, look at his hands. Nazario's fingers had indeed begun to turn an alarming shade, the circulation restricted by the overly tight handcuffs. The sight seemed to register with Crocker, who knelt down and adjusted them slightly. Minutes that felt like hours passed before the wail of an ambulance siren cut through the night air. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger. Some had come from inside the gas station. Others had pulled over after seeing the police lights, and still others were local residents who lived nearby and had heard the commotion. "That's a military man they've got on the ground," someone in the crowd said, loudly. "Look at his uniform." The comment seemed to ripple through the gathering, changing something in the collective mood. What had begun as shocked observation was shifting towards something more active, disapproval, anger even. The ambulance pulled into the gas station, its red and white lights adding to the surreal quality of the scene. 2 emergency medical technicians emerged, carrying their equipment as they approached Nazario, who was still handcuffed on the ground. "What happened?" one of them asked, kneeling beside Nazario. "He was pepper sprayed," the nurse who had intervened said before either officer could respond. "He needs his eyes flushed and his breathing checked." The EMTs set to work immediately, helping Nazario to a sitting position and beginning the process of decontamination. One of them spoke quietly to him, asking questions about his breathing, his pain level, whether he had any pre-existing conditions that might complicate treatment. As the medical attention began to provide some relief, Nazario found his voice again. "I want to know why this happened," he said, addressing the officers who stood watching the EMTs work. "I want to understand what I did wrong." Gutierrez stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only Nazario and those immediately nearby could hear. "Here's the deal," he said, his tone shifting from aggressive to something more calculating. "We can either charge you with obstruction, resisting, and assaulting an officer, which would probably end your military career, or we can just let you go if you chill out and don't make a big deal about what happened here." The offer hung in the air, its implications clear. It was a threat wrapped in the guise of leniency. Stay quiet about what happened or face charges that could destroy everything Nazario had worked for. One of the EMTs looked up sharply, having overheard the officer's words, but quickly returned, his attention to treating Nazario's injuries. The professional mask couldn't quite hide his disgust. Nazario said nothing for a long moment. The pain from the pepper spray had begun to subside slightly, though his eyes still burned and his throat felt raw. He thought about his options, about his career, about what had just happened to him, and why. "I shouldn't have to make that kind of choice," he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "This isn't how things are supposed to work." Gutierrez shrugged, unmoved. "That's the real world for you." The handcuffs were eventually removed as the EMTs continued their work. Nazario's wrists bore angry red marks where the metal had dug into his skin. He rubbed them gently, wincing at the tenderness. His uniform, a symbol of his service to the country, was now disheveled and stained. As the initial crisis of the pepper spray began to ease, Nazario became aware again of the crowd of witnesses. Many had their phones out, recording everything. Something about that gave him a small measure of comfort. What had happened here wouldn't simply disappear, wouldn't be his word against the officers. There was evidence. "You feeling better now?" one of the EMTs asked, genuine concern in his voice. Nazario nodded slightly. "Better than I was," he said, though better was a relative term. His body still ached from the knee strikes, his eyes and lungs still burned from the pepper spray, and a deeper kind of pain, the hurt of betrayal of injustice, had only just begun to register. The night that had started as an ordinary drive home had transformed into something that would change his life forever. As he sat on the cold concrete of the gas station, surrounded by medical personnel, police officers, and concerned citizens, Lieutenant Nazario couldn't have known that the next chapter would involve lawyers, headlines, and a national conversation about policing, race, and respect. In that moment, he knew only that something fundamental had been broken, not just for him, but for everyone who witnessed what should never have happened. The video first appeared on a local news website 3 months after that December night at the BP gas station. By noon, it had spread to national news outlets. By evening, it was everywhere. Phones, computers, and television screens across America displayed the shocking footage of Lieutenant Nazario being pepper-sprayed and forced to the ground while in his military uniform. In the small town of Windsor, Virginia, the gas station attendant who had witnessed the entire incident was on her lunch break when a coworker rushed over with a phone. "Look," the coworker said, pointing to the screen. "That's what happened here that night. Everyone's talking about it." The attendant watched in silence, reliving the memory of what she had seen. "I knew something wasn't right," she finally said. "You could feel it in the air that night." Across town, the truck driver who had stopped for coffee and ended up witnessing the confrontation was sitting in his living room when the story broke on the evening news. His wife noticed how he went completely still, eyes fixed on the screen. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's what I saw, but seeing it again..." He shook his head, unable to finish the thought. In homes across Virginia and then throughout the country, people watched the footage with reactions ranging from disbelief to rage to sorrowful recognition. The videos, both from police body cameras and Nazario's phone, told a story that was impossible to dismiss. The sight of a uniformed service member being treated with such aggression sparked particular outrage. A veterans group in Richmond held an emergency meeting the evening after. The footage was released. The small community center was packed with former military personnel, many still in their work clothes, having rushed over as soon as they heard about the meeting. "I served 22 years, said an older man standing at the front of the room. "I fought in 2 wars, and I never thought I'd see one of our own treated like this, not here, not at home." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "It's not just that he's military," a woman near the back added. "Though that makes it even worse somehow. It's that it could have been any of us, any of our children." The discussion continued for hours, raw and painful and necessary. By the end of the meeting, they had drafted a letter demanding action from state officials and organized a support rally for the coming weekend. Similar conversations were happening in living rooms, at dinner, tables in barbershops and church basements across the state and beyond. The footage had touched a nerve, forcing people to confront questions about race, power, respect, and who truly receives the protection of those sworn to serve and protect. In the governor's office in Richmond, Ralph Northam watched the video in stunned silence, his chief of staff and attorney general standing nearby. When it ended, he remained quiet for a long moment before speaking. "This is not who we are," he said finally, though the evidence on the screen suggested otherwise. "This is not who we can allow ourselves to be." Within hours, he released a public statement calling the incident disturbing and directing the Virginia State Police to conduct an independent investigation. The swift response was unusual. Typically, such matters would go through a lengthy chain of protocols before reaching the governor's level, but the footage had made the usual processes seem inadequate. Social media exploded with reactions as the video spread. Hashtags formed, comment sections filled, and the digital expression of outrage grew into something that couldn't be ignored. Celebrities and politicians began to weigh in, amplifying the story further. A high school teacher in Norfolk showed the video to her civics class the day after it went viral, then facilitated a discussion about citizens' rights and police procedures. The usually rowdy classroom was uncharacteristically subdued as they watched. "Why did they treat him like that when he didn't do anything wrong?" one student asked afterward, the simple question cutting to the heart of the matter. The teacher had no easy answer. "That's what we all need to figure out," she said, "and more importantly, how to make sure it doesn't happen again." In Windsor, the tiny police department found itself under intense scrutiny. Journalists from national publications descended on the town, setting up cameras outside the police station and requesting interviews with anyone who would talk. Most residents were reluctant to speak publicly, caught between defending their community and acknowledging that something had gone terribly wrong. An older couple who lived near the police station watched the news vans from their front porch. "Never thought our little town would be famous for something like this," the husband said, shaking his head. His wife sighed. "I just keep thinking about that young man in his uniform, serving his country and getting treated like that." The town council called an emergency meeting, held in the high school gymnasium to accommodate the unprecedented public interest. Every seat was filled with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The mayor, visibly uncomfortable with the attention, read a prepared statement expressing concern about the incident and promising a thorough review. His words were met with skepticism from many in the crowd. "What about Officer Gutierrez?" someone called out. "Is he still on duty while you're doing your thorough review?" The question hung in the air, unanswered initially. The tension in the room grew until the police chief finally stood up. "Officer Gutierrez has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of our internal investigation," he said, his voice barely audible even through the microphone. The response didn't satisfy many in the crowd. A middle-aged woman near the front stood up. "My son is in the Army," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Every day I worry about him being in danger overseas. I never thought I'd have to worry about him coming home and being in danger from the people who are supposed to protect him." Her words resonated through the gymnasium, met with murmurs of agreement and a few calls of, "That's right." Meanwhile, Lieutenant Nazario was trying to process what had happened to him, both during the incident and in its aftermath. The video's release had thrust him into an unwanted spotlight. Journalists called constantly. Strangers recognized him on the street. His inbox filled with messages, most supportive, some hateful, all of them reminders of the night he'd like to forget. His military colleagues had been overwhelmingly supportive, many of them outraged on his behalf. His commanding officer had called him into his office the day after the video went public. "How are you holding up?" the officer had asked, genuine concern in his voice. Nazario had considered the standard "I'm fine" response but found he couldn't say the words. "Not great, sir," he admitted instead. "It's a lot to process." The commanding officer nodded. "What happened to you was wrong, and I want you to know that the entire unit has your back." That support meant everything to Nazario, who had worried about how the incident might affect his standing in the military. Instead of judgment, he'd found solidarity. Civil rights organizations began reaching out, offering legal support and advocacy. After careful consideration and consultation with his family, Nazario decided to file a federal lawsuit against the officers involved. It wasn't a decision he made lightly. He understood it would extend his time in the public eye and force him to relive the incident repeatedly, but he also believed it was necessary. "This isn't just about me," he explained to his parents over dinner one evening. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to someone else." His mother reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "We're proud of you," she said simply. The Iwa words carried the weight of everything they'd taught him, about dignity, about standing up for what's right, about perseverance in the face of injustice. As the investigations progressed, more details emerged. The town of Windsor issued a statement confirming that an internal review had determined department policy wasn't followed during the stop. This admission, while significant, felt insufficient to many following the case. Civil rights leaders from across the state convened in Richmond, bringing together a coalition of organizations to address not just this specific incident, but what they saw as a pattern requiring systemic change. "Today it's Lieutenant Nazario in Windsor," said a prominent pastor at the gathering. "But tomorrow it could be any one of our sons or daughters in any town in America. This has to stop." Virginia Attorney General Mark Herring announced that his office would conduct its own investigation into the Windsor Police Department, examining whether there had been a pattern of civil rights violations. The announcement added another layer of official scrutiny to the case. For Lieutenant Nazario, each new development brought a complex mix of emotions. There was validation in seeing officials acknowledge the wrongness of what had happened to him. There was exhaustion from constantly reliving the most traumatic night of his life, and there was a growing sense of purpose, a feeling that perhaps his experience, painful as it was, might contribute to meaningful change. A community rally organized by the Veterans Group drew hundreds of supporters. Nazario attended briefly, standing at the back of the crowd, still uncomfortable with his newfound visibility. An older veteran spotted him and approached quietly. "Thank you for your service," the man said, offering his hand. "All of your service, including standing up now, it matters." The simple interaction stayed with Nazario long after he left the rally. As difficult as the spotlight was, as much as he sometimes wished he could return to the anonymity of his life before that December night, he began to understand that his experience had become part of something larger than himself, a conversation the country needed to have, uncomfortable as it might be. What had begun as a routine traffic stop had evolved into a national moment of reckoning, forcing communities to confront difficult questions about race, authority, respect, and justice. And somewhere in Windsor, Virginia, two police officers were about to learn that actions captured on camera can have consequences that extend far beyond a single night at a gas station. The Windsor Town Council meeting was packed beyond capacity. People stood along the walls, spilled into the hallway, and gathered outside where speakers had been set up so everyone could hear the proceedings. The small town had never seen anything like this. Not just the crowd, but the national attention. The TV news vans parked along Main Street, the reporters with microphones and cameras ready to broadcast Windsor's decision to the world. The council members sat at their usual table, looking uncomfortable under the harsh lights and scrutiny. The mayor, a man who had run unopposed for the past 3 terms, cleared his throat several times before speaking. After reviewing all available information regarding the December 5th traffic stop involving Lieutenant Nazario, "This council has reached a decision," he announced, his voice unsteady. "Officer Joseph Gutierrez's employment with the Windsor Police Department has been terminated, effective immediately." A murmur ran through the crowd, part satisfaction, part disbelief that action had actually been taken. Someone in the back began to applaud, and soon others joined in. Not everyone, though. Some sat with arms crossed, their expressions making clear their disagreement with the decision. Additionally, the mayor continued once the noise had subsided, "Our internal investigation determined that department policies were not followed during the incident. As a result, all officers will undergo mandatory additional training, effective immediately." What the mayor didn't say, what many in the room noticed, was that there was no mention of Officer Crocker, the second officer involved in the incident. He would face disciplinary action but not termination. This detail wasn't lost on the crowd. An elderly man stood up from his seat in the 3rd row. "What about the other officer? Crocker? He had his gun drawn too. He was there for all of it." The police chief stepped forward to answer. "Officer Crocker's actions have been reviewed and appropriate disciplinary measures have been taken. Due to personnel privacy regulations, I cannot comment further on those specific measures." The answer didn't satisfy many in the audience, and several people called out follow-up questions that went unanswered. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. What had initially seemed like decisive action now felt incomplete to many present. Outside the town hall, local residents discussed the decision with mixed reactions. "At least they fired one of them," said a young woman who worked at the diner across the street. "That's more than we usually see in these cases." "It's not enough," replied an older man beside her. "They both did wrong. They both should answer for it." Similar conversations were happening across the state and beyond as news of the decision spread. For some, it represented accountability. For others, it was merely a token gesture that didn't address the underlying problems. In Richmond, Virginia, Governor Ralph Northam watched the news coverage of Windsor's decision and knew it wasn't sufficient. The next morning, he directed the Virginia State Police to conduct an independent investigation into the incident, taking the matter out of the small town's hands and putting state resources behind finding the truth. "The events in Windsor demand a full, transparent investigation beyond the town's internal review," Northam said in his public statement. "Virginians deserve to know that law enforcement in this Commonwealth is held to the highest standards." The governor's intervention elevated the case further, ensuring it wouldn't fade from public attention. For Lieutenant Nazario, who had been trying to maintain some semblance of normal life amid the storm of publicity, Each new development brought fresh media inquiries and reminders of that December night. "I never wanted to be at the center of something like this," he told his lawyer during a private meeting in April. "But since I am, I want it to matter. I want something to change because of what happened." His lawyer, a civil rights attorney with decades of experience, nodded solemnly. That's why the lawsuit is important. It's not just about compensation. It's about creating a public record, about establishing that what happened was wrong, not just morally, but legally. They filed the federal lawsuit the following week, seeking $1 million in damages. The legal document laid out in precise detail how Nazario's constitutional rights had been violated that night. The excessive force, the illegal search, the threats made while he was in uniform serving the same country the officers had sworn to protect. The lawsuit filing made national headlines. On military bases across the country, service members followed the case with particular interest. In break rooms and barracks, they discussed what had happened to one of their own. "When I saw that video, I just kept thinking it could have been me," said a young corporal at Fort Lee, not far from Windsor. "I wear the same uniform, I drive the same roads. The only difference is he got caught on camera and most don't." His commanding officer, who had overheard the comment, paused before responding. "That's why this case matters. Not just for Lieutenant Nazario, but for all of you, for all of us." The town of Windsor found itself under unprecedented scrutiny, as Virginia's Attorney General Mark Herring launched his own investigation into the police department. His office requested years' worth of records relating to traffic stops, use of force incidents, and complaints against officers, particularly those involving race. In the small police department, this meant pulling files from storage, making copies, and facing the reality that their actions would be examined not just by town officials who knew them personally, but by state authorities with the power to impose significant changes. Officer Crocker, who had returned to limited duties after a brief suspension, felt the weight of scrutiny every time he put on his uniform. While his name hadn't received as much attention as Gutierrez's, people in town knew who he was. Some residents looked away when they saw him now. Others made a point of watching him, phone cameras ready to record any interaction he had with the public. "It's like working under a microscope," he told his wife one evening after a particularly difficult shift. "Everything I do gets questioned now." She had little sympathy. "You were there that night. You could have done something different. Maybe you should feel watched." Her words stung, but he couldn't argue with them. He'd replayed that night countless times in his mind, wondering what would have happened if he'd spoken up, if he'd suggested a different approach, if he'd recognized the man in uniform as someone to be treated with respect rather than suspicion. Months passed as the various investigations and legal proceedings unfolded. For the residents of Windsor, the national spotlight eventually dimmed, but the effects of that December night lingered in community tensions, in local politics, and in everyday interactions between citizens and police. The trial finally came, in January, more than 2 years after the incident. Lieutenant Nazario sat in the courtroom each day, listening as attorneys argued over the details of what had happened to him. The video was played and replayed. Expert witnesses testified about proper police procedures and how they had been violated. Through it all, Nazario maintained the same composure he had shown that night at the gas station, dignified, controlled, determined. When the jury returned with their verdict, the courtroom fell silent. They found that Officer Crocker had indeed conducted an illegal search under state law and awarded Nazario $1,000 in punitive damages. They also determined that Officer Gutierrez had assaulted Nazario and granted him $2,685 in compensatory damages. The total, $3,685, was far from the $1 million Nazario had sought, and far from what many following the case thought appropriate. Outside the courthouse, reporters thrust microphones toward Nazario, asking for his reaction to the surprisingly small award. "This was never about money for me," he said after a thoughtful pause. "This was about accountability and making sure what happened to me doesn't happen to someone else." The jury acknowledged wrongdoing occurred. That matters. His dignified response in the face of what many viewed as an inadequate judgment only increased public support for him. Veterans organizations issued statements expressing disappointment with the small award, but praising Nazario's continued service and character. Behind the scenes, the Virginia Attorney General's investigation was producing more substantial changes. To settle the state lawsuit, Windsor agreed to significant reforms. The police department would need to obtain professional accreditation, institute new training programs, and submit to external reviews of any use of force incidents. These reforms will change how policing happens in Windsor, the Attorney General announced at a press conference. They address not just what happened in this one incident, but put safeguards in place to prevent similar situations in the future.